Thanks so much for inviting me. I love this conference. I've got a lot to do, so I'm going to start out very quickly summarizing some of the central ideas of the book that Alan Hutchinson's paper critiques. I want to begin with a point that there are many different kinds of originalisms, both substantively but also at the level they operate. The claims that I make in the book are about originalism as an academic theory, right? As a theory of constitutional interpretation and construction. And I'm not making claims about originalist practice in the courts. That's a different matter. Just the book isn't about that. Okay, so the argument of constitutional originalism begins with the idea that originalism is a family of theories organized around two core ideas. One idea is the fixation thesis, and the other is the constraint principle. And the book argues for both of these claims. Fixation, the idea that meaning is fixed at the time each provision of the Constitution is framed and ratified, right? And that's true for two reasons. One reason is that the semantic content of the text is fixed by linguistic facts, by patterns of usage at the time the text is written. And then the second idea is that any contextual enrichment, or what philosophers sometimes call pragmatic enrichment, is fixed by the context of writing, and that's at the time of origin. The second idea is the constraint thesis, and the constraint thesis comes in different flavors, but the basic idea is that we are constrained by the meaning of the text, right? And there are many arguments for the constraint principle. Some of these are arguments of political morality, popular sovereignty, the writtenness argument, the rule of law argument, and some of them are based on legal norms, right? So, for instance, Will Bauda is working on a paper that argues that we might get some of the content of originalism out of the rule of recognition. Okay. So the public meaning thesis is the thesis that the relevant meaning of the Constitution is the public meaning. That is the communicative content, right? So it's the conventional semantic meanings of the words in the context of utterance, right? And the context, or the publicly available context of utterance, the publicly available situation in which the Constitution was written and communicated to the public. And then finally, there's the interpretation-construction distinction. Interpretation is about communicative content. Construction is about legal effect, right? And so I make the argument that there is a construction zone, that some of the provisions of the Constitution are vague, right? And that as a result, we need some method for filling in the content of the vague provisions. Some people reject that, for example, McGinnis and Rappaport. Okay, so just a couple of clarifications quickly. It's just a gross misrepresentation to say that these chapters show little tolerance for other forms of originalism. In fact, one of the sections of the book reconstructs what I think is a defensible version of original intentions originalism. It's a position I disagree with, but I tried to present that position in its best light. I do not adopt Hart on open texture. I specifically reject Hart on open texture. And that's relevant to the claim on page 6 that I have characterized the process of interpretation and construction as a simple two-step process. In fact, I say explicitly that it's not a simple two-step process. And when it comes to defeasibility conditions, I think that Hutchinson exactly misrepresents my position. I don't say that Brown v. Board is a model for what courts should do. I introduced the idea of defeasibility conditions to show that if Brown were justified on the basis of a defeasibility condition, that it would be an exception, a carefully cabined exception, and not the rule. So I don't accept the way that Hutchinson's paper presents my views in the book Constitutional Originalism. Myman's already noted that Hutchinson's two main lines of argument are deeply in tension, right? On the one hand, originalism cannot constrain. On the other hand, originalism is introduced so that it will constrain and lead inevitably to conservative results. Right. Now, what are the differences? Myman sort of poses the question at the end of what are the differences between Hutchinson and Solem. So there are a lot of differences, I think, although I think Hutchinson accepts some things that I say. I think that there are deep differences, right? So one of the deep differences is Hutchinson's claim that there is no historical truth, right? And he says that, in fact, there are many historians who think that historical facts are always a function of our current politics. Well, there may be historians who say that, but Alan and I clearly disagree about this. I believe in many truths, including historical truths. Another difference, Hutchinson's claim that originalism is an ideology and not a theory, right? So now, how does he defend that? One is by making a meta-theoretical move, right? He says all theories are ideologies. Of course, if all theories are ideologies, originalism and every other theory, including his theory, is going to be an ideology. He sees everything as ideological. In Heller, for example, he says that the choice to give primary significance to the operative clause versus the prefiguratory clause is ideological, and I just don't agree with that. I think it follows from the rules of syntax and grammar, regularities in syntax and grammar, and it's debatable, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. And if I'm wrong, then the Second Amendment means something different, but it's a matter of fact what the linguistic practices were. There's a passage from the end of the essay, I think, that's very revealing. And I think it gets to a core disagreement between Hutchison and myself. Here's the passage. I say that, look, if you believe in the rule of law and you believe that our society is tolerably just, then a compelling argument can be made for originalism. And Hutchinson says, the fact is that the converse seems to be true, right? Namely that if you believe that the Constitution we have is imperfect and not even reasonably just, and that the rule of law is of some value, then the idea of the Supreme Court bound by the law should give you pause, right? And I think that's profoundly important, right? If you reject the Constitution as not even reasonably just, then you have a very good reason not to be an originalist, right? If the Constitution isn't close to justice, if our basic legal order is sort of irredeemably evil, right, then you have a very good reason not to be an originalist. I think that's right. In fact, if things are bad enough, you would have reason to use any rhetorical ploy, any sophisticated argument, right, if that were the case. Finally, a little bit on Canada, right, and the doctrine of the living tree. I'd just like to remind you of this famous passage. The British North America Act planted in Canada a living tree capable of growth and expansion within its natural limits. Their lordships did not conceive it to be the duty of the board. It is certainly not their desire to cut down the provisions of the act by a narrow and technical construction, but rather to give it a large and liberal interpretation so that the Dominion, to a great extent, but within certain fixed limits, may be mistress in her own house, right? Well, that passage could mean one of two different things. One thing it might mean is entirely consistent with the kind of originalism that I've argued for, and that is that the text settles some questions, but contains some provisions that are vague or irreducibly ambiguous, and construction is required. Or it might mean something totally different. It might mean that because this is a foreign act, because we are talking about the British North America Act, that Canadian courts ought to have great freedom of construction, the power to adopt amending constructions, right? And in that case, the doctrine of the living tree is inconsistent with originalism. And I think the same thing could be said of the relationship between living constitutionalism and originalism. There are two different versions. Just one final point. There are different theories of construction. And so one can adopt a theory of construction that creates great judicial restraint. One could say that when the Constitution is vague, we will adopt the Thayerian principle, right? That we defer to the political branches. That's entirely consistent with the premises of originalism, because originalism can't tell you what to do once you reach the point that meaning has run out. Now, there are other alternatives as well. One of those other alternatives is to try to get enough meaning out of the text so that it will solve all of our constitutional questions. Mike Rappaport and John McGinnis have pursued that strategy, right? That's also an originalist strategy. But there's nothing in the new originalism per se that commits us to the idea that there has to be judicial discretion. The question is, how does construction work? And there are many different views about that question.